It's a massive, underserved, kind of untapped market. It's 60 million people in the U.S. And growing.
This is Creative Disruption, the intersection where entertainment, data, and creativity meet. Here's your hosts, Ricky Ray Butler and Derral Leaves.
And welcome back to the Creative Disruption Podcast, where we talk about everything that's disrupting the industry and people that are doing it. And I'm joined by my friend and cohort, Ricky Ray Butler. How you doing, Ricky?
I'm doing fantastic. Man, I think this is now like the fourth time in a row that you're saying cohort. So
that's just the way it is. Like, you just get over it already. We're cohorts.
I'm over it. I've now accepted it. Everyone, I am Derral cohort.
Hey, I literally going to get you a T-shirt that says I'm Daryl's cohort.
Please, I will wear every podcast.
Yes, you will. No, I'm really excited for this one because, we talk about different markets, different segments, and, just different types of target avatar. And this is one that's going to have a really great conversation on really going after a specific niche and what that actually means and where that's actually going in today's ecosystem. Do you want to kind of introduce our guest here today?
Absolutely. So we're really lucky to have Rich Hull. Rich Hull has, been a very successful executive producer. He produced She's All That, Get Over It with Disney, and then also did the story of Derral Royal, where he collaborated with Matthew McConaughey about Derral Royal. And Rich is not only a producer, but he's also been a very successful tech entertainment entrepreneur. He founded Pongalo, which later was acquired by VIX, which is owned by Univision, which is the largest free streaming platform for Latinx and Hispanic audiences. Rich, thank you so much for making the time to meet with us. You're a very big deal, and we're excited to geek out and learn from your experience.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
I got to just jump right in because, this is what we got to do, Ricky, here. But it's like, how did you get into this? Like, how do you actually get into the Latin mix of creating apps and so on and so forth from there? How did that all start?
It's a good question. So, the first part of my career was, as you mentioned, Ricky, as a film and television producer, and had probably done 25 or 30 different movies and TV shows. And I got into the digital space because I was teaching a film finance class at UCLA and getting all these questions about digital. That's all anybody wanted to talk about. And as a very traditional film and TV guy, I realized I better figure out what this digital stuff meant because I was not able to answer most of the questions. And so as I did that, I started an advisory business on the side that kind of gave me the catalyst to learn about the digital space. And I started making a bunch of personal investments and sitting on boards as LA was kind of becoming a digital media town. And so I learned about digital that way. And then I grew up in Texas, so Hispanic media has always been a part of my world. And a friend of mine had recently taken over a Spanish language DVD company that was the largest seller of DVDs for Spanish language at Walmart. And he said, you should join the board. This would be great. And I said, okay, that sounds cool. But I kind of know myself well enough. And I thought maybe if I really wanted to make a commitment to the board, I thought I might want to have an investment in the company. And so I did that, and not too long after that, the company went upside down, and because of the way I had made my investment, I wound up with 500 Mexican movies, and I thought, what am I going to do?
The telenovelas, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Smart investor.
So it sort of forced me to kind of draw on my Texas roots from growing up around Hispanic media, and I started looking at that ecosystem of what was happening in particular the U.S. Hispanic space, and it seemed at the time that there were kind of two large television players that seemed like maybe they wanted to be disrupted a little bit, and maybe kind of not focused on the mobile and the digital thing that some of the other bigger players had. And so that's really what I set out to build with these 500 Mexican movies. Was a Spanish language, Hispanic focus streaming service that was cooler, hipper, more interesting than some of the incumbent players. And I thought I'd just kind of figure it out as I went. And so ultimately, I did. So that 500 Mexican movie library became, now 20,000 hours plus of content. But
it's amazing.
It was really the original catalyst that got me into it.
So, Rich, I want to give people context because I think a lot of people listening to this podcast or watching the podcast, they're really connected to this space and they really understand avatars. But I don't think a lot of people realize how big the Latino market really is. And I think if you could kind of share on that, I think you have a lot more insight than most. Like, how big really is the market, and why is there a huge opportunity for anyone looking to gear to that target audience?
I love when you were kicking off this conversation and you called it a niche. It's a niche that's 20% of the U.S. population. So if that's a niche, then I guess I'm a niche player. But no, it's a massive, underserved, kind of untapped market. It's 60 million people in the U.S. It's and growing. Not to mention sort of the opportunity in Latin America. Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world, so there's a lot of Spanish speakers out there. It's a big addressable market, and what's interesting in Latin America is that they're a few years behind where we are in terms of connected devices and so forth, and so things like connected TV and Roku, and those are just coming online there, and so we have a little bit of a playbook for what's happening down there based on what happened in the U.S. But it's a massive market. We launched our VIX streaming service into Brazil last year, and that too is sort of a market within a market, because it's Portuguese content surrounded in a geographically by Spanish speakers. And so Brazil is the second largest media market in the world. So you can kind of go through and start to identify these massive pockets of opportunity, both in the U.S. and outside as well.
Yeah, I think it's something where a lot of people really don't realize that Spanish is the second largest language. Or second largest, most spoken language on the planet. And my daughter and son, they both speak Spanish and English. My partner, my wife, is from Honduras, and it's very interesting. I'm actually trying to get my daughter to make sure she figures out these two languages and then add Mandarin so she knows the top three languages. But what's so interesting is there's a lot of assumptions that we have is that, okay, this is a niche, or, this is not that, maybe that big. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, Derral, but just for myself, I remember I was talking to, someone that works at one of those top two companies of how, we are expanding, to target the Latinx community at our company, both with product placement and influencer marketing. And it was interesting. I mentioned something that was really stupid. And I said, yeah, it'd be great to open up an office in Miami. And she just stopped me right there. And she's like, no. That is so 1989. This community is so big and massive that, there's a much bigger audience in the Southwest, in California, in Texas, the Four Corner States, than there is, in a lot of these other parts that we just assume just have a very big population. And is that something that you're seeing with your data? Is that, obviously it's catered to LATAM, but in the U.S., where are you seeing the biggest pockets, geographically?
A lot of it is the usual suspects of where you would expect, right? So you mentioned some of them: California, Texas, Arizona, obviously Florida. New York has a huge Spanish-speaking population, particularly Puerto Rican. And so, we find pockets all over the U.S., which is really interesting. In fact, we find pockets all over the world. We're one of the larger suppliers of, Hispanic content to Amazon channels. And so we launched an Amazon channel in the UK not too long ago, almost just as a check the box kind of thing. And it's killing it. Who would expect? It's not because you don't think of the UK having this massive Spanish speaking population, but they're there. And ultimately it's interesting. If you think about kind of the US, only in the last few years have, to your point about sort of brands and major advertisers, only in the last few years have the major advertisers started going after this market in a massive way, as if they just got here. But I think what it is, it's the data. I think we've gotten better today about tracking data, identifying data, analyzing data, and we're starting to realize this is a massive opportunity. And so now you're starting to see those brands fall in line and really go after those audiences with really substantial budgets. Before, I mean, there was always a little bit of a, kind of a Hispanic budget that they would sort of push aside, but now they're really substantial budgets, and they're going after those pockets that you're talking about, and they're all over. I mean, virtually every city has them. I mean, we are a national streaming service. We don't just cater to California or Miami. We're everywhere, and and the data shows that.
I think what's interesting too is to look at, the newer influencers that are actually being more visible on social media. And a good chunk of them are actually from Latino descent, whether they're bilingual or their parents, immigrated or whatever. But they're some of the biggest on the planet have that, and they actually cater to both, audiences in that realm. But where the passion really hits is in Latino America, because it's like there's not a lot of influencers down there at this time. And, they're just getting big, and some of them are getting stardom, going from 0 to 5 million subscribers in just a short amount of time. We're talking like just, 6 months, 8 months, just because there's just that demand that's there, and it creates that really huge ripple effect that's there. And I lived in South America for a couple of years, and I've traveled to Brazil, and I just don't think people realize how big the market is. How big Brazil really is, how big South America is. Well, I think we're just kind of more, we're territorial thinking about the United States, but this is a huge opportunity, especially what you said, is you can almost anticipate, hey, the playbook's written, all we need to do is just kind of deploy it for this new target demo down in this geographic area, and it's going to take off. And we've seen that with the project that Ricky and I are working on. Brazil is just going like wildfire right now. Just because people are just salivating for good content. And some of that good content is finally now reaching that market, and they're just big consumers.
Well, I mean, I agree with all of that. That's true. And you mentioned sort of influencers and social media. I mean, that's part of the opportunity here. When I started Pongalo, it was a subscription service. And that is where I thought the opportunity was at the time. And then suddenly, as I got into it, guys like, Apple started making noises about coming into the subscription space. And those are people you really don't want to compete with. And so it forced me to go and think about what the free space looked like. We call it AVOD, so ad-supported video on demand. And there were people in the general population space in the US like Tubi and Pluto and Zumo who were killing it with free content and on demand. And so ultimately, we sort of just took the playbook from those guys and replicated it for the Latin market, and sort of became the Hispanic Pluto or the Hispanic Tubi. And that's probably a very legitimate, description of us. But ultimately, a year or so ago, I looked around and realized that my biggest expense was acquiring users to bring to my service, after we had already sort of evolved into the largest player for the Latin free ad supported space. And so ultimately, the reason we combined the Pongalo assets and the VIX assets together was because VIX had the largest social media footprint in the world for the Latin market. So 100 million Facebook followers alone.
That's so crazy.
So for me, that was just this massive megaphone, right? So you were talking about influencers, coming out of Latin America, going from 0 to 5 million subs. All of that was interesting to me because that's that megaphone that allows me to talk to this massive audience. And we work with brands on the social side to create brand entertainment, but we also can talk to those people for virtually no money or no money, right? And we're using it as a funnel to essentially drive people from the top of the funnel, which is social, down to the streaming service. And that's part of the opportunity for us, is to really sort of kind of let them travel down that funnel. And then when we've really sort of gotten them contained in our streaming service, give them that great content, because great content, to your point, keeps people there. I mean, we give people a great value. I mean, there's nothing more valuable than free, right? And so, and if you don't mind watching a few ads, and ultimately none of us do if the ads are not intrusive, it's a pretty good value, but ultimately it's the content that keeps them there. And so that's really been part of our challenge, is to just constantly keep flooding people with great content, figuring out how to market it to them. All the best content in the world means nothing if nobody can discover it on your platform. So we're constantly going and trying to, refine our user experience to help us market stuff to you better. And in fact, we even built our own technology streaming platform, which, people that are wanting to stand up their own streaming service these days can either go, rent that technology from somebody else, or they can build it themselves. We built it ourselves, which, building your own technology stack for video streaming is not for the faint of heart. So I'm not sure I'd recommend that to most people, but it gives us complete control over the platform. So we are constantly able to iterate and offer new ways to discover that cool content. And so we're always trying to sort of chase that opportunity that you're talking about through stuff like that.
So, Rich, I would like to I want to explore the megaphone effect, because I don't think a lot of production companies or studios, they really get the power of it. I think they relied so heavily on, we got A-list celebrities that's going to be pushing the product, and we're going to be doing so much. And I want to use this as in parallel. I was watching the Super Bowl, and my favorite thing about the Super Bowl is the ads, and seeing how they would place A-list celebrities in there to help pitch or help elevate the content. And then you have someone that I've worked with and I'm partners with on a couple of things, is Mr. Beast, who gets like 500 million video views a month, and he's doing stuff that just immediately within 48 hours is getting 30, 40, 50 million video views on his content. And I think the difference is the community approach, and where you can create a megaphone is getting people invested in what you're doing. How are you able to translate that once you're able to, acquire a new company or whatever, you just merge it or whatever you did? But how did you leverage it to really further your voice in getting more people connected with what you're doing?
Well, I would say that, kind of first and foremost in social, you've got to entertain people. Nobody likes to feel like they're being advertised to. So we were much in sort of a BuzzFeed type way. We were spending a lot of time creating meaningful, good content that felt like it was entertaining in and of itself. And if it had a message of go check out our streaming service, that's okay. But ultimately it was entertaining. So we'd say things, just like on BuzzFeed, here are the top 5 J-Lo movies ever made. Well, as it turns out, we've got 3 of them on our streaming service. Click here to install. So it starts there. And that was sort of the first reason to combine the Pongalo assets and the VIX assets. The second reason was, advertising sales. So VIX had an existing ad sales team of 50 people stretched across 2 continents. It would have taken me, many millions in a couple years to build that. And so by combining the Pongalo and the VIX assets together, we could then immediately on day one start monetizing through direct sales. So there's kind of 2 ways you make money in advertising. One is through programmatic sales, which is sort of a real-time auction to, let a bunch of computers bid against that potential ad inventory. And the other is by having guys out there knocking on doors, selling direct ads. And the real money to be made is through the direct sales ultimately. And so tapping into that with VIX was a way for us to, really sort of turn this opportunity into something particularly special. And then what that did for us is it ultimately sort of created enough scale that then, Univision came in and recently acquired VIX earlier this year. So, the journey for me is that ultimately I set out to kind of disrupt Univision by creating Pongalo, and now here I am in the family at Univision.
That's how it works.
That's usually what happens.
No,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
exactly.
Well, so it's interesting, there's a lot of talk, in entertainment around Korean dramas or like K-pop. It's taken the globe by storm. I actually wonder with the content and the pop culture from Latam or from the Latinx community, if it's becoming even bigger. And the reason why, not only because obviously there's a lot of people around the globe that speak Spanish, but you see trends like reggaeton. Like I encourage my team over like music videos to make sure whenever we're working with a brand that's doing global global activations and trying to get global audiences, that they should probably prioritize, if it's a good affinity, a reggaeton artist, because when I'm in Sweden or China or Japan or anywhere in the globe, I'm always hearing reggaeton beats and music just blaring out there. And so what's interesting, Derral, that's obviously happening with dramas, and you're showing that, being the president of VIX, that, this is a global play, not just a domestic, United States audience, play. But one thing that I've noticed, and as Derral said earlier, there are a lot of, creators that, are part of the Latinx community, and a lot of the content that they're creating is not in Spanish. It's in English. And I understand, Television as well as Univision are trying to figure out how to better communicate, with this new, millennial audience from the Latinx community that primarily makes content in English. And so I was wondering, are you starting to open up your portfolio to English speaking, or do you have plans of doing that in the future?
It's a good question. When I was first starting Pongalo, I made the decision to go after the Spanish-speaking audience. And there were a lot of people. In fact, there was a very prominent kind of LA VC fund that was just absolutely ready to write the very first check, and bailed out because somebody had explained to them that they thought the bigger opportunity was in English language content for the Latin market. And so I stuck with that decision, and I think it ultimately turned out to be the right decision to kind of stay within kind of the Spanish language, lane. There is a market for, English language content for Latin audiences, particularly in the US. The challenge with it is that you really have to thread this needle to have, Latin appeal, but mainstream, or Latin feel, but mainstream appeal. Because going after English speakers who have, who culturally are Latino, those are people that grew up here in the US. They grew up watching Disney shows. They grew up watching English language content. And so it's a real needle you have to thread. And so we've just made the choice not to do it so far. We could in the future make some decisions around, trying to open the aperture a little bit, but there are also streaming services that do really well with that, Netflix, for instance.
So Netflix is like killing it for sure on that.
Yeah.
I think this is where I look at where the future's going is kind of a hybrid approach. And I think Netflix introduced this. There was a TV show that kind of hit Netflix by storm called Money Heist. It was produced in Madrid, Spain. But I think they're doing a great job at dubbing and getting an audience in the US, but it goes vice versa too. And then some things that most people don't know is YouTube's actually exploring right now, and they're doing it with certain creators where you can switch out an audio track. And so now you can go, whether if you have it dubbed in Russian or Spanish or Portuguese, they can actually do it when they're geolocated. And it's like, okay, all it is geolocated by the area, but also the context of how they're consuming YouTube. They now can get it in their native tongue, and that's actually going to be huge. And where they can do it like automatically and switch between it, just like they do in Netflix, that's going to be one of the biggest disruptions. And I see the creators that are bilingual that can do it, whether it's English and then also Spanish version, but using the same context of the video, and people can switch it. I think it's just going to blow up. Where they're going to get tons of new subscribers, tons of engagement. But you made the perfect point. It has to have that Spanish feel, that Latino feel to give it a lot of context. And I think some creators are just going to knock it completely out of the park when it comes to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Money Heist is a great example of a show that that is paying dividends because the dubbing is so good.
Yep.
Traditionally, you didn't sink a ton of money, which is, dubbing is expensive. So it was hard to sink a ton of money, particularly into episodic dubbing. And so with Money Heist, they did such a good job of it. The casting of the voices is so good. You
So good.
know, the authenticity feels good. I mean, just everything about it just really feels like they spent a lot of money and went the extra mile, and that's translated into a lot of success. I love the show. I thought it was fantastic. You know, we powered through the first two seasons of it, and never once did I think, this feels off. It's a little dubbed. You know,
Yeah.
it felt great. So I think there's a big opportunity. I mean, we're doing great right now with Russian content and Turkish content, which, you know, is produced in their native tongues, but then dubbed into Spanish. But culturally, it kind of feels right. And some of that is because they kind of originally stole the telenovela format from Latin America, and now they're just giving it back. But but nonetheless, you know, I think that there's big opportunities. I mean, the world we live in is getting far, you know, way more global than it ever has been, and there's a lot of those opportunities to sort of move content around if you find, you know, cultures that resonate with each other, and I think that's what you're seeing with Money Heist.
Yeah, we Ricky and I produce a show called The Chosen, which hit the was it number 4 on the apps in entertainment just
Yeah.
recently, Ricky?
No, yeah,
So
today.
we're doing good. Yeah, no, it's awesome. But one of the things out of the gate with our distribution partner was to do amazing dubbing, and the first area that we hit was Brazil, because it's like Brazil's massive, and then we did like the Latino Spanish dubbing, and like speaking fluent Spanish, a little bit of Portuguese. I was blown away of how amazing the dubbing is if it's done right. And I think that's what, like you said, Money Heist was able to do. And I think a lot of new catalogs that's coming into Netflix, they've done the dubbing. It's just amazing, regardless of where the origin of the language was. It's just getting that dubbing right. And I think that's making the biggest difference, because if it feels off, then you're going to go, it was okay. But if it was like right on and right on par, then it's just like, okay, they're sucked into that universe. And I've just seen so many bad dubbings in Spanish. I'm like, why do they even use that word, or why is it even done this way? It's just really, really horrible. And I think that's where when you create an amazing IP, that's where the next generation is. It's like, okay, how do we globalize this? And the best way to globalize it is getting a really good dub in that for that series or movie.
I mean, I guess the next conversation we should be having separately is about getting your show onto one of Univision's streaming services, huh?
I definitely would love to have that conversation. And we are doing a little bit different approach. We just literally are trying to put season 1 everywhere. We just got on Peacock and a few other places, but we have our own app because we do believe in owning our own audience as well. But yeah, like 100%, I'd love to have those connections for sure. So we're going to be talking right after this
I
podcast.
promise
For
you,
sure.
Rich, this was not the purpose behind inviting you to this podcast.
Yes, we brought you here to have a conversation with you.
You never know with Ricky, though. He always has that little subtle strategy going
All right,
on.
all right, let's negotiate it right now. I'm just joking. Well, no, it's interesting, you know, what you're both saying about dubbing. You know, I have not seen a show yet that I've liked the dubbing for, and a lot of it, you know, especially if it's Spanish speaking. When I'm with my wife, she refuses, to listen to the dubbed version because she wants to hear it in her native tongue, and I'm just expected to read it. And so I'm gonna have to try it with Money Heist.
It's so good, Ricky. You'll actually like it because you like the mafia slash,
Oh, yeah.
kind of stuff like this. One's just so amazing. The storyline is off the charts, and the character development is off the charts. It feels like, I won't put it on the same category as Breaking Bad, but it's a pretty close, with the character development of this and how they lay it out. I love it. So.
Well, I know there's a lot of people really into it. One of our engineers actually has that mask, behind him, on his Zoom calls because he's like so into the show.
Yeah,
now, Rich, where do you think this is all going? Like, what is going to be the next, wave of distribution, for the Latinx community and for the Hispanic, content across the globe?
It's a good question. If I had a crystal ball, no, what I think is probably going to happen is I think you're going to see advertisers coming in and being a lot more involved. Part of the challenge in having a global platform is that there's not that many global advertisers. There are U.S. based advertisers that are spending U.S. budgets going after U.S. audiences. even that same brand in Mexico may have a very different audience they're going after and a very different budget and different people, right? And they rarely talk to each other. So brands are starting to figure out ways to kind of play a little bit more globally. I think they're finding better and better ways of being a part of financing content, and integrating their stories into content in a way that doesn't feel, wonky or intrusive. I think, one of the things that happened, I watched, our friends at Amazon, build Amazon Studios, and really they focused on the US first, and their original strategy was to create English language shows and then sort of pump them out across the globe, and now I think if you were going to start Amazon Studios today, you would start it with more of an international focus, right? Or a global focus, right? You wouldn't just focus on creating content for the US and hope to push it out. You'd be trying to, create content that would resonate in countries all around the world. You'd set up production hubs in, Mexico, and in emerging markets like Saudi Arabia, and,
Sure.
places that are really sort of burgeoning. And you would kind of do that all concurrently. So I think you're going to see more of that, more of sort of a global focus, more integration with advertisers. I think that I'm biased, right? But I think that the free streaming market is a real untapped opportunity, because Netflix has done a great job of establishing, the paid streaming service game.
Yeah, and
But
they're globalizing too with all those different locations
they've
as
done a
well.
great job of building a global platform. But, there are some countries in the world where everybody doesn't have an international credit card like they do here in the US.
Mhm.
They can't afford, even that, $10 a month for a streaming service feels like a luxury item. And so for us, we're sort of going after the, kind of the rest of those people that don't have a Netflix subscription. Um, and I think that's a big opportunity right now too. And I think in the U.S. we've seen that. We've seen kind of trailblazers like Pluto and Tubi and guys that I mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, really sort of create that market for free content, which is, it's circular, right? You're talking about being able to see content for free with ads. Sounds a lot like television, so kind of what's old is new again. But I think that's a big opportunity around the world.
I think the difference though is, and just this is really important though, freemium content's great and if it's ad supported, but they get to pick their destiny. It's not a broadcaster saying, this is what you're going to want to watch. This is all you get. No, they got titles to go and look, and they can kind of consume it. And then the algorithm kicks in to help them predict what type of content they should see next. And so I think it's a beautiful world when it comes to really getting to watch what you're into. But it's really at their own fingertips. They don't need to wait anymore. They have to wait same time, same place, same channel. No, they can watch it like 2 o'clock in
They
the morning if
choose.
they want to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of leveraging that with, so Univision has this streaming product called Prende, which just launched, in the last couple weeks, and we're sort of taking kind of a best of approach as it comes to that, linear channel programming that you're talking about, and we're using, the linear channels that are on our streaming service as almost Barker channels to introduce people to new content, because you do love that experience of just kind of flipping around to see what's on. But then when you find a show that you really like or a movie that you really like and you want to kind of dig more into it, that's when you can kind of hop over to the on-demand experience. And so we're seeing that being, a really great Barker channel, almost a big advertisement for, for merchandising content. So it's not exactly like it was in the old days, Derral, like you're talking about, where you got a guy in a room deciding what you're going to watch at 8 p.m.
Yep.
At least it's being used as a way to introduce you to that content in the hopes that you'll then go dive deeper in an on-demand experience, which is what you're
And
talking
I
about,
think,
Ricky.
yeah.
Where you control your own destiny.
And I think that's where YouTube's kind of like it's done a lot of great good. But the first thing it was is they've monetized it. People are used to ads now. It's like they get it, and and they're willing for people that want the ad-free experience to pay a subscription if they want to. But if not, they can do the ad-driven integrated system. But I think at the end of the day, it's about the catalog, right? And that's the most valuable thing: is how big is the catalog. And then two, how fresh is the catalog? I think that's going to be the challenge moving forward. And I think these big studios, are putting a lot of money behind refreshing their catalog. But I really do love Netflix approach where they go acquire great movies and just get a really good dubbing. So they're putting all the effort and energy saying, hey, this Norwegian show just took off, or this show from Australia really took off. Let's actually integrate it as a Netflix original. And I think that's where the biggest thing would be is, getting the catalog so it's big enough to really keep people coming back every day, seeing something and discovering something new, but also fresh enough. And I think that's where the challenge is going to be, is because everyone's kind of being, hey, this is our own playground and you can only watch it here. And I think that's going to exhaust the viewer. I really do. I think that's going to exhaust the viewer, and it's going to be really hard to keep up. However, there's not a lot of competition with Univision. So,
I mean, I might add one more thing, which is authentic enough. Right?
Yeah.
Because I think what differentiates our streaming services from a Netflix is we kind of the authentic curation of the content in a way that you're not going to necessarily get on a Netflix, which is a general population service. There's something there for everybody, right? We very much know who our audience is. As an example, we during the pandemic, there was a movie called Windows on the World that was the new Edward James Olmos movie. Some producers we know made it. We really loved the movie. It was about an undocumented Mexican immigrant not in the World Trade Center in 9/11, and nobody knew whether he lived or died because he wasn't on any official list of employees in the building. And we thought that was sort of an interesting thing to kind of dig into, and it's Edward James Olmos, so everything he does is a great performance. And so they had planned on doing a theatrical release on that movie last summer. Obviously, kind of the world shut down, the movie theater shut down, so we did the world premiere on our streaming service, and then that kind of became the anchor tenant where we built a channel around all of these young emerging Latin filmmakers. Because if you think about it, there's a bunch of great filmmakers that came out of Mexico about 10 years ago, Alfonso Cuarón and Guillermo del Toro and the guys that are winning Oscars today, right? But there have been less of those kind of the next generation that have really gotten a ton of notoriety. And so we decided, well, let's curate a content offering around those guys, because Windows on the World was from a young Latin filmmaker. And we were like, well, let's go find other young Latin filmmakers that have a story to tell. And we built a whole channel around that, exposing these new, fresh, diverse voices that, wouldn't otherwise have, come to you. And then we went to our partners at Target, who kind of sponsored the whole thing in a really cool way. And because everybody loves to hear themselves talk. So we told all the filmmakers to, put their iPhones in front of their face and talk about what it means to have their film featured on this channel. And then use that to create all this really cool, authentic content that was sort of like almost shoulder content that kind of we could wrap around, the films and make it a whole experience, almost like you would have at a film festival if you were to go in there. And we did it all, while the movie theaters were closed down. So that's what I talk about when I'm talking about kind of authenticity around curation. It's that kind of stuff that I'm talking about that I would add is, kind of another thing, to add on to the, Derral, your point about, volume and freshness. And, when you're trying to kind of dig into the content of it all, I would add authenticity to that.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. You were mentioning earlier that, a lot of brands don't look at it from a global perspective. They don't have global budgets. And I think that's starting to change now as well. So what we've noticed is, when we have, clients that spend over, 8 figures on digital creators or influencers, we're noticing a trend that a lot of these brands are now starting to build a global team, because influencer content on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram or Twitch, they're always going to have a global audience. And what's interesting is, especially in the digital side, of the world, or the social, creator side of the world, in England or Australia, where do you think the majority of their views are coming from? They're actually coming from the US. It's a much bigger population. And we've noticed that exact same trend when it comes to, doing product placement, whether it's, on television or SVOD or, across Netflix, across a lot of these, different platforms, is that when there's a really good series that comes out of the UK, most likely it's going to get more impressions and more views from a US audience. And so we're now starting to encourage and also starting to notice on more of the traditional side or long form content where brands are realizing that they need to take a very global perspective and have a global play, because all content it's all going to stream now, but it's also going to be global. And you now need to look at the different nuances of, targeting a more local audience to looking at and expanding to being relevant to an entire global audience as well. And it sounds like, that of course is happening there. And we'll, we do a lot with brand integration on both social content and across all the SVODs. Like our brands are in 95% of the major SVODs, from like a Hulu to like a Netflix. We're in a lot of that content, and more and more we're realizing is that we have to get more and more global, and brands need to make global a much bigger priority. Now, with that said, when you work with brands, like do you ever like bundle product placement with your media buys with like pre-roll or with ad spends? Like, is that an area that you focused on?
Yeah, but we do it in a slightly different way because we don't spend a lot of time producing original content. So what we do is we will sell, to go back to the example we were just talking about because it's top of mind. With Target, when we were doing what we called our Latino Voices channel, which are kind of fresh young Latin voices that have new films to offer. Not only were they kind of running media, so running ads, pre-roll ads, mid-roll ads, post-roll ads, that kind of stuff, but then they were also, kind of sponsoring the channel. We were finding other ways to kind of integrate their brand. So it was not true product placement the way you would in a piece of original content, but we were finding ways to integrate the brand that aren't just pre-roll ads. And so that package, I think, becomes important because you want to get the brand's messaging and vibe across, right, in the proper way. But you also don't want to, you don't want to watch a piece of content that's got the same commercial over and over, and we see that all the time, right? And so you've got to be very thoughtful about how you build those packages. And just because a brand is wanting to spend that money with you doesn't necessarily mean you should always take it. It's important to kind of balance the user experience so that it doesn't feel like someone's being advertised to. You don't want to create a streaming service that feels like a subway car, where you're just constant advertising. So I think it's a balancing act. And it sounds like you're dealing with that every day, right? If you're trying to integrate, advertisers into content that's going to wind up on these subscription streaming services, you've got to be very cautious about not being too heavy-handed with it and also being on message for the brand. It's, if it were easy, everybody would do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. For the most part, we've never worked with any of the streaming services. It's always been directly, with the production companies or with the producers. And you're right. It has to be authentic to the storyline. It has to be very empowering. It has to, improve things, not disrupt or distract whatsoever.
But as a former producer, I guarantee you those producers are thinking about the streaming service, even if you're not, right? Because they're trying to think, whether it was financed by Netflix or they hope to sell it to Netflix, ultimately, they have to be cautious about what they do with brands to keep it integrated into the story in an authentic way. Otherwise, Netflix is going to look at that as a potential acquisition and say, it all worked except for that one weird scene that
100%.
And so it's that's the balancing act that has to happen.
Yeah, because on the other side of the spectrum, it's like, do you want to off-brand cola? Do you want to be making up products, or does that like kind of negatively impact the authenticity? And so it is really balancing out and just making sure. We talk about this a lot, but the brand and the content creator or the producer, they have to reach a consensus to make sure that it's something that's very empowering to the storyline and not disruptive. Because if it is disruptive or if it looks like an ad, that's not good for anyone, from the streaming service to the production company and especially to the audience.
Well,
No,
I like Rich's example about the target, though, like inspiring filmmakers that are coming up. I mean, that's an integration that actually has legs. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's where brands need to take a step back and get out of, hey, we're pushing our product and we're going to do this ad and all this integration type stuff, to say, okay, how do we actually weave our narrative, our storytelling with some other storytelling that's happening? And I think that's where that one's brilliant, because you could wash, rinse, and repeat that over and over again, where it's an initiative every year or every quarter of discovering talent that's creating content that's getting funded in a unique way, and then, you know, coming into the library. I think that's really, really fascinating for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, it's the holy grail when you can really sort of nail it, and a few years ago, I was making a lot of kind of the teenage movies, some of which you mentioned, Ricky Ray, when you were sort of setting up this conversation. And those are great. They pay the bills. But, the question is, do they change the world? And I kind of felt like, if I've got this platform in Hollywood, I got to do something that changes the world. And so, the project the documentary project that Matthew McConaughey and I made that you mentioned earlier, that was one of those, right? It was a passion project for both of us, about the guy who's the football coach at the University of Texas that we both grew up, cheering for. And another one of those is one where I partnered with a filmmaker named Frank Martin and Halle Berry. And we made this documentary about Black soldiers that had fought in all the U.S. wars we've ever had, but often never had their stories told. And so the project was called For Love of Liberty, the story of America's Black Patriots. And Halle was the host, and it had everybody we'd ever met in Hollywood in it, who was kind of a household name, 50 or 60 household name sort of celebrities, helping to tell these stories. And so the U.S. Army came in and became the title sponsor for that. And that felt super authentic. And what a great way for the Army to get their message out, to tell some of these stories and to talk about efforts they were making in diversity. And so we actually went on sort of this nationwide tour with all these, multi-star generals that would show up to these screenings and tell these stories, before we would then run clips from the film, and create a national conversation about, diversity in the armed forces, and where that had worked well and where it has not, and where they can improve. And it really became a catalyst to something really special. And so the Army got, their money's worth, in multiples. And when you can do it like that, it just feels great. And, Hallie and I won an NAACP Image Award on that, and on that film, because it all sort of worked, right? And that's the holy grail when you can kind of find it.
This has been a very fascinating conversation. I think that if we were to take a step back and just ask an additional question here, and I think this is an important question, because Ricky already asked the one of where do you see the industry going, but if you could go back and just know the knowledge that you know now, just a year ago or 2 years ago, about something that was just kind of an aha moment that kind of opened up, your business model, or just really grasping a concept, what would that be? What does that look like?
I would have raised money in Bitcoin.
I think all of us, 100%.
That's a sensitive topic here.
Yeah, Ricky sold his Bitcoin.
All of it in December. It was horrible. Horrible.
Well, at least you got to sell it. Most of the people I know that bought it early on had their wallets broken into and had it stolen. So you're ahead of the game.
Yeah.
I think what happened in the, if we had a crystal ball, it'd be easy. But I think what happened in the pandemic, I think just accelerated a lot of trends that were already happening. So, cord cutting is one. We were, the VIX streaming service was growing at a really nice clip. When the pandemic hit, it was like it went on steroids. And so I think if I had anything to do over again, it would be, sort of more prepared for those, the unexpected happening in the world that accelerates those trends. Because then what happened for us is it became a massive game of whack-a-mole, where we had built a plan where we were going to grow our service to a certain scale, and it was going to be a nice steady pace. And the whack-a-mole came in because we suddenly started growing so fast that then when you grow that fast, that means you need more content because people go through the content faster. It means you need more customer service because more people complain. It means you've got to have, more robust technology infrastructure, because if there's, one person streaming, you need this type of technology. If there's 1,000 people streaming at the same exact time, you need a very different kind of technology. And so we were constantly trying to chase that to make sure we didn't have downtime. So I think it's that having that plan in place, that for those unexpected pandemic, sea change events, that would have been great to know about a year ago. But we managed through it, and we had no downtime. We were able to grow our content offering thousands and thousands of hours every quarter, way faster than we expected. We added a whole team of people in Mexico that could service, customer service in a way that, I think at the time here in the US, we were just trying to make sense of, the COVID of it all. And it was hard to hire people. And so we found ways to do it. And that's what being a good operator is, I think. My partner in all this is a guy named Rafael Urbina, who was the founder of VIX. And so when he and I brought our assets together, we were every day trying to figure out how are we going to survive just one more day, and I think we ultimately did a pretty good job of it.
Well, Rich, thank you so much for joining us. It was a really fascinating conversation. I think there's a lot to unpack and digest on this one. Ricky, any last thoughts before we close up?
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Rich. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys for having me. And since I just found out that you and I are virtually neighbors, I'll look forward to seeing you walking around the neighborhood.
Yep, you might see me later today walking my dog.
And we want to thank everybody else for listening to this podcast. Thank you so much. Make sure you follow and share and do all the things that you do, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everyone.